this event, and second, to all of you for coming in on such a fantastic day. Now, I'm conscious that there's a pretty thick layer of irony in having an Englishman come over. Is it? Yes, I think so. How's that? Is that better for volume? It may just be that I talk too. Okay, let me try that. Is that any better if I project a little more? Okay. Wave if I forget, because I do naturally speak a bit quietly. Now, I'm also conscious that we're very close to the Easter weekend, and that therefore there's somewhat of a layer of irony involved in having a bloody Englishman come over and tell you about ethics. But I think also that anniversary gives us an opportunity to reflect solemnly on how our view of ethical behaviour changes over time. And hopefully that we will now start to take different factors into account as we consider what counts as ethical behaviour in our online activities and with the data that we all reveal in the course of our daily lives. So I have a few slides. They tend to be fairly loosely related to what I actually talk about, but hopefully we'll cover most of the essentials. And that's going to work much better if I turn it on. Or maybe not. Bear with me a second. This will be exciting. Put that down. Apologies. I should have tested this first, shouldn't I? There we go, that's better. So, a very quick couple of words about the Internet Society for reasons which will become obvious in about 2 slides' time. The Internet Society's slogan, as it were, is that the Internet is for everyone. And we want to try and make sure that the benefits of the Internet reach those who can make most use of them. And that involves increasing the accessibility of the Internet to places where it doesn't necessarily reach. But also where the Internet is in place and is used to try and make sure that, that it's used in ways that are beneficial to all of its stakeholders, not just, for example, commerce or governments, but also all of us as individuals and society in general. So, and this is a reason, one of the reasons why I'm so happy that the Adapt Centre was able to host this talk, was that actually our missions are very closely aligned in some ways. We both kind of operate at the intersection of technology and commerce and innovation, but also in ways that translate between, for example, industry and policymakers and consumers, many of whom, especially on areas like privacy, tend to talk different languages and often talk past each other. So a lot of our work, I think, is to do with translation. The Internet Society is present in many places, and I'm delighted to say that I was able to add a small green dot to this now. There is an Internet Society chapter for Ireland, and I'd encourage you to find out about what it does, because the things that it does are driven by the things that are pressing to you. If you would like to find out more about it, Stephen has given me permission to disclose his personal information, so Stephen Farrell here is a great person to start with. Well, he's a great person to start with. Okay, so some things that I wanted to talk about in the next 35 minutes or so, and leave plenty of time, I hope, for discussion afterwards, are to look at some of the issues that arise when we use the Internet, and some of the things that don't work very well in terms of ethics and the use of our data. And then to take a slightly more academic look at some standard ethical models and see whether they actually explain how we could do things more ethically online. And then to look at how we might progress in that area. But ultimately, I think the questions we're trying to answer are, well, should we care about ethical data handling? And if so, who should care about it? Who are the principal stakeholders? And if assuming that we as individuals do care and that we have some interests here, how can we get what we want? So when I first started thinking about this, well, I suppose a little under 2 years ago, it seemed to me that there were definitely some problem areas, and so I'll sketch those out, and then we'll have a look at 3 of the standard ethical models. Actually, that's an interesting one. So can I just get some idea of the makeup of the room? Who's currently doing full-time academic study? Yeah. Who would describe themselves as involved more in the policy side of things, policymakers, regulation, that kind of thing? Who's coming off the street and thought they were going to get a thing about the Book of Kells? Right, so just, okay. So, put less frivolously, are you just sort of, would you say that you're a member of the general public who is interested in this kind of thing? Good. And who's from a computer background? Now, the interesting thing is that you're split between the left and right sides of the room. It's amazing how often the techies all end up without saying anything on one side of the room. It's something to do with the halves of the brain, I think. And who's from a sort of more philosophical, sociological, religious type background? Okay. Now, see, they are all on this side of the room. All right. So, there will be some jargon in this. If at any point it's not clear, please fling a hand up and call me on it. Okay, so some areas where I noticed there was already a problem. Oh, and I should probably explain the reason why I sort of build this as with that murder theme is that a lot of the ethical issues seem to me to be the classical whodunit ones of means, motive, and opportunity. Stuff is done to our data about which we don't necessarily have the opportunity to control what someone else does. And they often have both the means to collect data about us and process it, and the motivation to do things with it which are not necessarily in our interests. So some of this discussion is going to be about how we represent those interests and how we regain some element of control. So the first kind of problem area is around this idea of no surprises. The idea here is, it's more of a guideline, and the idea is that if what you, as a data controller, are doing with someone's data comes as an unpleasant surprise to them when they find out that's what you're doing, then maybe you should have some ethical second thoughts about that. Flip it the other way around. It's a good test of whether what you're doing is okay or not. To look at your processing of personal data and say, well, either this is okay because we've been upfront and we've told the user this is what we're doing, so notions of consent come in, or we haven't actually told them, but we're pretty confident that if they found out what we were doing, they'd be okay with it. Okay. Now, obviously, ethically, that second one is a little bit more thin ice, but you can see how it would work in some circumstances. So, is that what we've got at the moment? And I think my basic starting point for thinking about this whole ethical data handling business was that we can all think of things that are done with our data which are, strictly speaking, legal, but which we don't necessarily like, or which give us a queasy feeling, or we're convinced are simply downright wrong. So how can we reconcile those two things? Can we change the law so that only ethical things are allowed, or is it always going to be a matter that the law will take you so far, and then after that, someone has to be making ethical decisions? Now it's probably not the time scale to get into the whole discussion of whether the law is an ethical thing or not, but we can have that offline if you like. I don't think it's any coincidence that Justice A has a blindfold on and B has a sword in one hand. Let's just leave it at that. Okay, so in terms of things that are legal but unpleasant when we find out about them, I suppose the name Snowden tends to crop up in that kind of line of thought, doesn't it? Because to my mind, what we learned when we found out via Snowden's disclosures what was going on, particularly with government processing of personal data, collection and processing, was that actually there was quite a gap between what a number of legal instruments say about the processing of personal data and what was actually happening. Now, a couple of the places where I do work on ISOC's behalf are, for instance, the Council of Europe, which is a human rights organisation based in Strasbourg, but with a number of non-EU signatories to its conventions on the processing of personal data. And they, like the OECD and like the European Commission, have all been reviewing and revising their guidelines on the processing of personal data. And this phrase, necessary and proportionate, crops up in an awful lot of legislation to which your government and mine are signed up. Typically it comes in the bit about law enforcement access to personal data, and it comes in the form of an exemption. It says law enforcement can have an exemption from the provisions of its data protection law, but only insofar as it is necessary and proportionate for a lawful purpose in a democratic society. So there are a lot of qualifications, even about the use of personal data for law enforcement and things like intelligence and national security. But I think what we found from Snowden was that some governments have been paying, at best, lip service to that principle. And that actually they were doing things which, strictly speaking, were legal, but in terms of ethics, clearly failed the necessity and proportionality test by the standards of any reasonable person. You probably, I don't know if you would have seen them or not, but both in the US and in the UK, there were a lot of closed-door hearings and discussions and arguments between lawyers, for example, on behalf of Amnesty International or Privacy International, and the intelligence services about their interpretation of terms like that. And the same thing, similar things happened in the States, where there were legal decisions and legal findings that had happened behind closed doors, but which were being used as statutory interpretations of the law by the intelligence and security services. Which is why I think it's important that that phrase, in a democratic society, is in the legal instruments. Because in a democratic society, it's questionable whether those kinds of decisions should be made in secret, and the basis or the interpretation of texts like that should be completely unpublished. So I think what we've got now is a situation in which there can be very unpleasant surprises about the use of personal data, whether it's by governments or whether it's by commercial organisations or other kinds of data control. But if we're to have no surprises, that implies a number of things. It implies effective notice and consent, for example. It implies transparency of things like the interpretation of legal texts. And it implies the accountability of data controllers for the things that they do with your data. Well, it also might imply things like fairness. Because I think that there's, I've used the phrase up here, what distinguishes legal from legitimate. I think for something to be legitimate, you have to be confident that there is transparency and accountability, that you have redress when something goes wrong, that someone can be made to put things right if they've done something that you didn't agree to or that disadvantages you. But in the real world, that's often quite hard to achieve. You might not know that an organisation has collected data about you. And if you do find out they have, there may well be some kind of built-in power asymmetry that makes it very difficult, for example, for you as an individual consumer to convince a large corporation to do what you want with your data rather than what they want. So, much as I would love there to be a principle of no surprises, I think the way that things are set up at the moment means that there frequently are, and that those surprises are likely to go on happening. So one question will be, is there anything that we can do, for example, to redress this asymmetry of power in the relationship between you as a data subject and the organisations collecting and processing your data? Is that the same in the commercial context as in the government context? And then what do we do about special cases like law enforcement and national security? The second problem area that I came up with was one I ended up calling ethical dilution. And really, this is about the internet as it is today. Now, who still uses a browser to get on the internet? Okay, some okay, I think that's most people. All right, not necessarily the only way, but you use it, yeah, at least. Okay. Does anyone use Firefox? Has anyone got a plugin on Firefox called Collusion? Oh, not a plugin, come on, Stephen, everyone's got some plugins on Firefox. I think it's called Collusion or Lightbeam. Anyone heard of that one? Yeah, okay. There is a plugin you can put into your Firefox browser that when you go to a site like the Irish Times or the New York Times or the Washington Post, will give you a little map showing which other sites that site connects to. So what sites have got embedded links on there, which sites set cookies, beacons, and so on. If you haven't tried that, I'd encourage it. You won't necessarily like it, because it might worry you. But I think that might be a healthy thing. Because you find that some of the sites you go to are very profligate, they're promiscuous in a way. They have all these third-party relationships, which are not necessarily obvious to you. And most of those relationships are to do with the collection and monetization of data about you. Now, I don't know if you recall signing up to that. You may have thought you were going to look at the news, but probably somewhere buried in the site, or in their privacy policy, or in their cookie terms and conditions, there might be a thing saying, by the way, you agree to us having all these links and beacons with third parties. Well, how much of that ecosystem, how many of those other third-party providers are visible to you as the average user using a browser to go to that site? Probably close to zero. Now, the reason I asked if you were using a browser is that at least if you're using a browser, you've got the option of, for example, putting that plugin in and actually being shown how many other websites the Washington Post has beacons from or sets cookies for. With other devices like mobile phones, that may be much more difficult to achieve. So part of the direction of travel here is from a relatively high function browser way of getting the internet, where you as a user might well have the option of putting in some plugins to show you more about what's going on, to what might be a much more constrained way of getting at data. On your mobile phone, you probably can't put a plugin in. You might not be using a browser as we know browsers. You might be using deep links. Your ability to see what's going on may well be constrained, and that seems to me to be the direction of travel. So we're putting our trust in something which gives us less and less information about what's actually happening. The reason I mention that is because of what those third-party sites are doing. One way to think of this is as a food chain. So we'll take the ecosystem model. You are the kind of bottom, we're the plankton in this food chain, unfortunately. There are lots of us, we're not very nutritious individually, but we manage to support slightly bigger organisms, and ultimately there are some large carnivores out there who are actually making all the money. But that food chain is typically invisible to us, because that's the first link in it, and we're not getting much information about it. So the data about us goes through a number of steps. It's collected, it's aggregated, it's filtered, you're profiled, you're put into one bucket rather than another bucket. The bucket is then handed over to an advertising placement company, and they decide what sort of adverts for which companies should be placed in front of you and when. So there's a whole food chain there which you neither see nor influence. The other metaphor I use is that this is the motor, this is the engine of the monetization of personal data. And it's driven by, its raw material, its fuel, is information about us. And it's a very powerful thing. Economically, that mechanism pays for most of what happens on the internet. Most of the free services you get are paid for by the monetization of personal data. And the more personal data there is, the more powerful that engine becomes, and the harder it is for us as individuals to influence its direction or its speed. So I call this ethical dilution because the further down that food chain you get, the less connection anyone has with the individual who gave rise to that data, and the less responsibility, if any, they feel towards you. So if you're in that food chain, as an advertising placement company or a data aggregator, the fact that an end user may have some qualms about what's happening with their data probably exercises very little effect on your behavior. So how can we perhaps change that balance? Can we reduce the dilution of this ethical effect as data goes down that food chain? The third of the four areas that I wanted to look at is this idea that, and again it comes back to the way that ecosystem is set up, that everything we do online is mediated. Everything goes through at least one third party. If you go online by using your phone, then everything you do goes through your phone provider. If you've got cable at home, then everything is going through your cable provider. If you use Gmail, then everything you do is going first through your comms service provider and then through Google. If you go and browse a website, then everything you do is going through your comms provider and the website and whoever hosts the website, and then the rest of the food chain to do with the monetization of personal data. So everything that we do online is mediated. And there's often an asymmetry in that relationship. You might not even know the entities with whom that relationship exists. And you're just a consumer to them, and they set the rules. I mean, cookie warnings are a great example of that. That you go to a site and it says, we use cookies, do you like that? Press here for yes. There's no no button, and it usually, well, if there is a no button, it usually just spits you out. So there's a built-in power imbalance there too. Now, in part, that power relationship is just a function of the fact that you've never met the people you interact with online. I've got a neighbour on one side who I trust because if a parcel is left, he always brings it around. At least I assume he always brings it around. Maybe that's where that whiskey went. But as far as I'm aware, I think he's pretty trustworthy because he seems to always bring the parcels around to me. I don't so much trust the neighbour on the other side because he throws snails over the wall. I'm English, so I don't know their names. We've never actually spoken to each other. It's only been 15 years. These things take time. You shouldn't engage in random, spontaneous conversations with people just because they live next to you, because who knows where that could be. So this trust thing, it takes a while to build up. But then what happens when you go online? You interact with organisations and people and companies you may never meet. You certainly don't have the option of throwing snails back over the wall, not that I would ever do that, or drinking his whiskey when it's delivered to your house. Perish the thought. But in that online environment, there has to be some kind of alternative, some proxy for the relationship you would have if it was face-to-face. So to that extent, this asymmetry in online relationships is perfectly understandable. I'm not suggesting we want to do away with it, I'm suggesting that we need to find ways of managing it better. Now I think I pinched this from Churchill. I think he was one of the people who is reputed to have said that democracy is the worst of all systems except for all the others. And the same thing kind of applies to this idea that the Internet Society prefers in this kind of environment, the so-called multi-stakeholder model. It's a bad thing in the sense that it gets boiled down to a soundbite and then everyone says, oh, well, we did this in a multi-stakeholder respectful way, and you're expected just to move on and take that at face value. But actually, when you think that everything we do is mediated, and yet we as individuals have very little power over the organisations we deal with, actually a multi-stakeholder model of resolving issues like the processing of personal data starts to make sense. Because someone has to be around the table. And if no one is at the table representing the interests of the end user, well, who is going to represent those interests? We come back to that thing about means, motive, and opportunity. Those service providers have the means and a strong motive to monetize your personal data. And so someone needs to be at the table, at least representing users' interests. Sometimes that's done by civil society. In other cases, civil society are more concerned about human rights or disaster relief, for example, and may not actually know some of the technical ins and outs that should be fed into that discussion. So I think there is a role for this multi-stakeholder model. But we've always got to bear in mind that whether you think someone is a good actor in the system or a bad actor in the system often just depends on your perspective. I think the other benefit of starting out with the assumption that you need a multi-stakeholder model is that it encourages you to take different cultural perspectives into account. I remember going out for supper with a Japanese colleague and asking him if he thought attitudes to privacy in Japan had changed in his lifetime. And he was about 40 at the time. This was about a little under 10 years ago. And he said absolutely. When he was a small child, he lived with his parents in a small apartment with, I think, two other siblings. And he said basically, I had no expectation of privacy at all. There was one communal living room where we ate and where we spent most of our time. I shared a bedroom with at least one of my siblings. There was one telephone in the house. There was no internet. And that was the context within which I lived my family life. Then he said, fast forward to my children. So he was 40 then, his children were under 10. And he said, they expect to have their own bedroom. They expect to have their own mobile phone. They'd like their own internet connection, but if they don't have one, their phone will do. And they have completely different expectations about being able to live their family life in a way that encapsulates, that parcels off one part of it and says, actually, the family may be in the sitting room, but I'm doing other stuff with my friends online in my own bedroom. So I think not only do privacy expectations change from culture to culture, but within cultures they can change surprisingly rapidly. Okay, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about context. You don't have to read very far into the subject of privacy before the idea of contexts comes up. This again is something which I have shamelessly pinched, in this case from Helen Nissenbaum. And she wrote a seminal paper about what she called contextual integrity. Probably the best way to illustrate that is with a so you go to your doctor and you discuss some embarrassing ailment with him, and you go out and he's prescribed some tablets and you go away happy, and then you're online later and you think, well, I wonder if these are the right tablets. So you type in the name of your ailment and out comes a website with you on it. The website is Humorous Ailment of the Week. And you realise that your doctor thought it was such a hilarious condition that he's posted this thing saying, you'll never guess what I saw today. So how would you feel under those circumstances? You'd probably feel somewhat shocked, and you'd probably feel that your privacy had been violated. And one explanation for that is that you disclosed the details in one context in which you had very specific expectations about what would be done with that data, and more particularly what would not be done with it. And yet here you are finding the same data outside that context in ways that violate the privacy that you thought you had between you and the doctor. So Nissenbaum would describe that as a violation of contextual integrity. And it helped to clarify for me what a relationship there is between our feeling of privacy and our feeling that we can manage the contexts in which we disclose different kinds of data. Now, this isn't a technical thing. This is an interpersonal thing. I don't know if anyone else had the same experience. I remember getting home from school as a small child once, and my mother opening the door and saying, "I want a word with you, young man, because your teacher has told me X." And I thought, what the hell? Adults talk to each other. That was at school. That was in the school context. This is the home. Anyway, so my first experience of contextual integrity violation. So I think we learn about those things very early on, just through interaction with other people. Because privacy is actually not about keeping everything confidential. It's about disclosure, but disclosure within a context and with expectations about the scope and purpose of what we're disclosing. So there are lots of contextual issues about privacy, which I won't dive into. But maybe one, say, about healthcare data. We've had this thing in England lately where the government wants to reach into your family doctor's records once a month or so and take an extract of your electronic care record and put it in a big database. And they say that this is, for example, to give a much bigger database on the basis of which they can make longer-term predictions about public health and the resourcing of the public health system. But then there are some other contexts involved. That data then gets aggregated and sent to commercial insurance providers, for example. It gets sent to commercial companies doing drug research and clinical trials. It's accessible to organizations who have the means and the motivation to do things with it that are not necessarily in your immediate interests, but we're being invited to consent to that for the long-term public good. So there's an immediate ethical trade-off there. Do I, as an individual, think that my healthcare data should remain private to me, or am I happy for it to be disclosed for some potential future good that might come out of clinical trials or drug research? As I said, I don't think that's one to dive into, but it's the kind of ethical issue that crops up very early on when you start scraping away, particularly at things like healthcare data and its use. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Okay, a history of ethics in 5 minutes. Alrighty, so once I figured out there were some basic ethical issues that are essentially baked into the way the internet works, I looked at, technically, could we just fix the internet instead? And then shook my head and wandered away from that as far too nasty a set of problems. There are things we can do, but really the other thing I wanted to do was, is there anything in ethics that gives us guidance about where we could go from here? So I had to look at 3 basic ethical models. Typically, if you start doing ethics, the first one you're introduced to is this idea of consequentialist ethics. In other words, an action is good or bad, depending on whether the consequences it has are good or bad. It sounds pretty good. It's very intuitive. You know, if I kick the dog suffers pain, and therefore that was probably bad. If I find a wallet and I give it back to the person who just dropped it, then they feel happy, and that's probably good. So consequentialist it's nice and simple and it's intuitive. But when you try and apply it to the internet model, some things start to come unpacked. For instance, in that ethical food chain that I talked about a little bit earlier, the consequences of you disclosing your data are very far removed from the act of disclosing them. So you as an individual may find it very difficult to make a judgment about whether it's good or bad ethically to disclose this piece of data. Because the harmful consequences, if there are any, may be in the form of an unwelcome advertisement or some spam or the hijacking of your identity. But that may happen a long way down the line, and you may not be able to associate the harm with the thing that gave rise to it. Now, as primitive monkey-like beings, that's not how we handle risk. We're sort of evolved to handle risk of a tiger appearing in front of us. If that happens, all sorts of physiological changes happen which make us react. that's the kind of risk that we can really react to, and we'll learn from it. And if a tiger bites your leg off on one occasion, you'll remember that tigers are bad. But on the other hand, if you eat a donut, or you smoke a cigarette, or you have a drink, there's no immediate bad consequence. If you, like me, tend to sit poorly or not take enough exercise, there's no immediate bad consequence. And that, like privacy behavior, is why so many of our long-term habits have very bad cumulative consequences, but the individual actions that give rise to those consequences seem not to do any harm. So a consequentialist view is theoretically nice, but practically it's really hard to make it work in terms of encouraging people to take better privacy decisions. There's also the point, oh actually no, I'll do that in the next bit. Here we go. Okay, so once you've kind of found some of the flaws with the consequentialist model, next thing they tend to throw at you is this idea of a deontological model. Has anyone studied Kant? Poor you. I managed to escape doing that, so I've had to reread it later, and it made my head hurt. But a couple of things he said did seem quite useful to me. This is the point at which anyone who has actually genuinely studied Kant sort of writes me off as a half-wit. But one of the things he said was, you know whether something is a good principle to act on because you would be willing to have it expressed as a universal law. If it doesn't meet that criterion, then it might be good in some cases, but you probably shouldn't rely on it overall. And another thing that he said was that humanity should not be treated as a means only, but as an end in itself. And those were among his kind of founding ethical principles. I think the second one of those is interesting because it seems to me that certainly in this monetization of personal data, I think that's arguably very much what is happening to us. We're being treated as a raw material. In fact, you often hear the phrase, personal data is the new oil. Well, that's great, but they say it like it's a good thing. I mean, oil has catastrophically, what's the word? Ecosystem, ecological side effects, which we now recognize and which we expect people to manage. I think we need to carry some of that understanding over into the privacy domain. Okay, in the interest of time, we'll crack on a little bit. All right, so a bit more up-to-date than Kant. In 1971, I think it was, John Rawls wrote a book called On Justice, where he set out some principles which actually might be practically applicable here. So, for instance, he introduces this idea that you know if something is just because it demonstrates fairness. Now, in some ways, he effectively looks back to Kant in the sense that Rawls said, when you're making the rules, if you're the person who is put in a place to make the rules, you should not know what role you're going to play in the system that those rules control. Okay? So you're allowed to decide the rules of the game, but you're not going to be allowed to decide whether you're the hunter or the hunted, so to speak. Now, if you don't know which of those two roles you're going to occupy, you're much more likely to come up with a set of rules that is as fair as possible to the hunted, as well as the hunter. So in that sense, he was harking back to what Kant said about only acting on those maxims that you would consider valid as universal laws. And also there's this business of the most extensive liberty consistent with a similar liberty for others. If what you do as the processor of personal data unwarrantedly constrains the opportunities of others, then perhaps that is out of balance with a just approach. So I do think there are things about Rawls's approach in general, just in terms of principles, that actually offer certainly questions we can usefully ask about fairness and legitimacy, about openness and transparency, and about accountability, because you might build that in if you don't know which role you're going to play in the system. Okay, so what's happening next? I'm only going to pick one example out of this just to give an illustration. I talked a little bit earlier about that metaphor I use for the monetization of personal data. I described this as the engine which drives much of what happens on the internet, and that we are part of the raw material that fuels that engine. I think that engine is about to get turbocharged, because what happens with the Internet of Things is that we see a massive explosion in the number and type of devices that generate information about us. If you have smart light bulbs or a smart thermostat, they generate information about who's in the house and when. If you've got a smartphone that's got location services on it, it generates masses of data about where you are and when, what your travel patterns are. The accelerometer in a Nokia phone, before they went out of business, their research people found that after it had been in your pocket for long enough, a few months, they could predict whether you were likely to get back trouble later because it was able to analyze your walking patterns. As the number of Internet of Things devices goes up and the data they generate about us goes up, so does the volume of raw material that fuels the monetization process. So that engine, as I say, is about to get a massive boost in input and in power. When you think also of the number of systems which are increasingly autonomous, I think that's quite a worrying combination. In terms of what I call, well, I'm not the only one who says it, but I describe it as user agency. Agency is a fancy term for what is it in the system that gives effect to your wishes. Well, if you're surrounded by Internet of Things devices, which, whether you know it or not, are spewing out personal data about you, and if that environment also includes autonomous systems that do things based on their rules rather than yours, then I think the potential for you to lose agency grows and grows. I tried to come up, you probably noticed I'm not very good at sound bites, but I tried to come up with one for this, which is that if personal data is the new oil, then Internet of Things is the new global warming. It's an environmental shift, and actually just turning off one IoT device has no effect. It has to be a cultural shift about how they're used. Okay, I'll leave the bit about autonomous cars because it's a wonderful bit of future gazing, but actually there are more pressing things in the shorter timescale. And so what we're trying to do on this in the Internet Society, and I'll be back here in a month for a workshop on this, is to find examples of practical guidance, put them somewhere useful, and make them accessible. The goal is that if an organization can be led to ask itself the question, how do I do ethical data handling in practice, that we can point them somewhere and say, go here. And there will be things there about how to build values such as ethical ones into the design and development process, how to build them into the operational processes that companies adopt, and so on. There is actually an encouraging amount of stuff out there that addresses those topics, but it tends not to make it that last step into the awareness of stakeholders who should be using it. So that's what I'm hoping to do in the course of this year, and I'd very much hope that at some point I can come back and test some of it on you. And with that, I think over to you. Any questions?